Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you very much for the invitation, and good morning, everyone. I will try to tell you about French nuclear policy over the 10 years, and maybe to trying to join the dots between those two quite crucial statements by French presidents. François Hollande, about 10 years ago, who said France needed to reduce its dependency on nuclear power, and Emmanuel Macron, shortly before he was re-elected last month, who said, emphasized that France's energy and ecological future depends on nuclear power. And that kind of summarizes the way French nuclear policy is kind of struggling somewhere between myth and reality. I need to start maybe by a very brief reminder to everyone about status quo, just to emphasize how nuclear energy is important and has been developed in France. You all know that, but it's worth mentioning that it represents roughly 70–75% of electric generation, although that only means 20% of the overall final energy. But on top of that, the French nuclear industry has been heavily developed with a lot of nuclear reactors, 56 still operating. On top of that, a very comprehensive integrated fuel cycle industry and some international ambition. I won't talk about that part, but Steve said some very relevant words about it. I just want to emphasize the kind of political lock-in that we found ourselves in, just through a series of key evolutions over the past 10 years. First of all, when President Hollande introduced this objective of reducing the share of nuclear power to 50% of electric generation by 2025, this objective was enforced in a law in 2015, and then there was a strategic plan which already kind of derived from this objective, but still had an objective of shutting down 14 reactors by 2035, which would mean a life extension still to 50 years or beyond of most of the reactors that would remain. We had at least 2 reactors shut down in 2019, but then a new law postponed the deadline from 2025 to 2035 to meet this 50% objective. And the most recent developments, I mean, these are not yet real decisions, but commitments by the President Macron to postpone any shutdown and search for life extension of most of the reactors to 60 years, unless safety reasons would require them to shut down. And on top of it, obviously announced this new reactors program of 6 new EPR reactors and possibly 8 more. The way this has evolved is really, I mean, telling about multiple lock-in effects, and I won't describe and discuss all of them, but I want to just set the picture. First of all, there's a series of kind of technical lock-in effects which really rely on the specificity of the French electric system, with a high thermal sensitivity due to massive development of poorly efficient electric heating. But I mean, dealing with this electric vulnerability issue, when you talk about reactors which you need to phase out or shut down by steps of roughly 1 gigawatt, and on top of it, you need to do it not only for a few reactors, but massively, with a massively aging fleet, and through decision processes that are mostly based on a 10 years period for each reactor. I mean, this is in itself a nightmare, which would call for much more anticipation and so on, but we don't anticipate for some deeper reason rooted in the nuclear system itself. The historical burden, especially the financial burden on EDF, will I will comment further on that. The issue of piling up materials and waste with no real perspective to deal with them, and the geopolitical dependency. Just one sentence about it. About 2 years ago, President Macron made a very important speech in Le Creusot, where heavy components for nuclear reactors are manufactured, and he said, quote, civilian nuclear, military nuclear, one does not go without the other, which is in itself a kind of ending point to any discussion on a nuclear phase out from an energy perspective, if you consider that France sticks, of course, to its nuclear deterrence policy from a security perspective. One of the key issues the French nuclear policy has to deal with is the aging and life extension issue. Just a few words about it. First of all, we are, like in any country, an aging reactors fleet, over 35 years now on average in terms of years of operation. But most importantly, about 80% of the reactors were started in roughly 10 years' time, between 1977 and 1987, which means that any management scheme, whether it's about life extension through these decennial periodic safety reassessments, or any management through for shutting them down, if you stick to this 10 years period for each reactor, and you have the on the right the schedule of these reassessments or reexaminations. I mean, if you stick to it, it's first of all very massive, and second, very inflexible when it comes to managing electricity security through phasing down, at least, of the nuclear capacity. This has some consequences on the costs, and I mean, I just don't want to go into details of cost, but start with this figure, which goes back to 2012, when the French Cour des Comptes, or Court of Editors, produced for the first time a comprehensive assessment of the overall cost of the nuclear program. In blue, you have the past cost, and there's not much discussion to have about it. In orange, you have ongoing costs, and the point is that mainly due to heavy maintenance, reinforcement, and increasing operating costs, these current costs are increasingly going up. And you have the issue of future costs, which are related to decommissioning and long-term management of waste and nuclear materials. These are still uncertain, probably very underestimated and rising. And the overall picture hasn't changed, it has reinforced within those 10 years. It's the perspective of increasingly non-profitable assets, which are the reactors with their increasing operating costs. But not only that, but the perspective that they will massively turn into heavy liabilities at some point, especially because the financial provisions which are meant to cover those long-term costs are still clearly insufficient. That applies to decommissioning costs. We don't know, like anywhere else, what these future costs will be. What we know is that France is probably heavily estimating its cost. You can see a figure which is more than 5 years old, but sets the projected or real cost in European countries. France has a projected decommissioning cost per kilowatt, which is almost 1/3 of the average in the European Union, which means, and of course, if you multiply by the number of reactors, this can become very dramatic very fast, that some additional provision will be needed at some point. The same applies to so-called reusable materials. We have obviously so-called nuclear waste which pile up, and there are some waste disposal facilities, but not for the most critical of them. There's a program to reach that at some point, but we have more specifically, due to a very complex management scheme based on the reprocessing of spent fuel, we have a very critical piling up of various categories of so-called reusable nuclear materials, which for some of them are not reused or are not likely to be reused in the future, especially with the changes in the long-term French nuclear policy, giving up on fast breeder reactors more specifically. There are issues with operation of some of the plants, reprocessing plants, the MOX manufacturing plant, and this leads to an issue of some materials like spent fuel, reprocessed uranium, and irradiated plutonium piling up, and there is currently a very high issue of shortage of storage capacity in the coming years for spent fuel or unirradiated plutonium, for instance. This leads to a kind of headlong rush policy, if I might call it so, which is completely summarized by one sentence by Jean-Bernard Lévy, CEO of EDF, that is back in a public hearing in 2018. He said, EDF is like a cyclist who has to pedal, not to fall. And that meant EDF needs to avoid the financial bankruptcy, to extend as much as it can the life of existing reactors and to work on the building of new reactors. When it comes to existing reactors, the issue we are facing is a clearly decreasing performance over time. The average performance, the average availability is appears in gray on this graph, and on the lines you have the actual availability in the past year and in the current winter. There's clearly a decrease over time, and there is clearly a very significant situation right now that combines both the heavy periodical safety reassessment schedule and a significant unplanned factor, which is the stress corrosion cracks in crucial parts of the primary circuit. This means 28 reactors out of 56 are, as of today, in planned or unplanned outage, and most, even more significantly, EDF is planning for an unprecedented low in the planned availability of its reactors over 2020 and 23, down around 55 to 60% only. Looking at cost competition, I mean, it's clear, like anywhere else in the world, that nuclear power has lost the competition against renewables. I mean, you can see some figures now here from a very recent study by Greenpeace and Institut Rousseau, based on EDF and other figures. This does not only apply to new build, but also to existing reactors, which are less and less profitable. And of course, the unavailability factor that I just mentioned will make it even worse. When it comes to new build, Steve told you about the very bad experience. You know about the story of Flamanville 3, probably. I mean, the initial plan was to have it starting in 2012 at a cost of a little more than 3 billion euros. We are now up to more than 10 years delay and a cost of 20 billion, but 19 billion actually when you take into account the financial cost. And that doesn't prevent EDF from planning for new reactors with, as Steve emphasized it, kind of simplified design, which is heavily discussed because it could mean recession on some key safety features. It's still in a very early design phase. The generic license is not planned to be granted before at least in 2 years' time. The official cost estimate by the government is at least 46 billion euros for 6 reactors, but that is the lowest figure, and of course that could be a lot more. And the first service of an EPR2 of that kind is not expected before 2037 at the earliest in the latest government estimate. The overall discussion about new nuclear reactors is taking place within a broader discussion on the carbon neutral strategy that France has set for itself, with a lot of discussion, as you can see in that graph from a recent RTE, which is the grid operator study, a lot of discussion on the share of electricity in the overall reduction of energy demand. RTE produced some scenarios, and I mean, you will get some details about the mix in the different scenarios in that slide. The important thing here is that, first of all, RTE introduced for the first time 100% scenarios by 2050 or 2060, meaning that it acknowledges the feasibility from an electric security as well as carbon neutrality point of view of such scenarios in the French context, which is a really significant step for the debate. When it comes to costs, you can see some evaluation there. The overall picture is that all the systems, all the scenarios roughly range in the same level of cost, with some advantage for nuclear-based scenarios, but these advantages come from globally favorable assumptions, and RTE introduced some sensitivity analysis showing, for instance, that if you only consider fair capital cost conditions for renewables and nuclear instead of state-backed ones for the new reactors, this kind of puts all scenarios on the same level. And we also have an also recent study by the French Agency for Renewables and Energy Efficiency, which also has different scenarios, also some scenarios which roughly reach 100% renewables. And you can see on those pictures that those scenarios with more renewables are the most competitive when it comes to complete electric system costs by 2050 or 2060. So as a conclusion, I mean, Emmanuel Macron recently said, no expert says 100% renewables is realistic, serious, possible for our nation, which is a clear denial of what official agencies provide as evidence to the government and therefore to him. The French nuclear strategy is clearly struggling with an increasingly adverse reality. Pursuing nuclear plants is driven by the need to maintain military capacity, to postpone heavy financial issues, to maintain a dynamic to sustain competencies, but these plans for life extension and new builds are bound to face increasing hurdles, and it's really not clear now how much the support that the government seems ready to bring will allow to overcome those hurdles. And that's it for this very rough and brief picture of French nuclear policy dynamics in France. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pane Marignacu, za prezentaci a představení situace ve Francii. My tu máme nějaké dotazy i od našich diváků. Vlastně jeden z nich tady s námi sdílel takovou tu mapu, ve které vlastně můžeme vidět, jak jednotlivé evropské země jsou závislé na nějakých konkrétních zdrojích energie v konkrétním čase. Vlastně u Francie tam vidíme skutečně ten obrovský podíl té jaderné energie, který se tam táhne tím grafem souvisle. Víme tedy, že vůbec to udržování těch jaderných reaktorů je nesmírně ekonomicky náročné, nejen ekonomicky, ale i časově, personálně, ale přeci jenom, když vidíme tam tu stabilitu, kterou dosud ty jaderné zdroje poskytovaly, tak není to přeci jenom výhodné si tu stabilitu udržet, byť je to veliký finanční výdaj, tak zkrátka, že ta stabilita je cennější než jakékoliv vysoké náklady.
Well, there are clearly two issues here. I mean, it's clear to everyone that thanks to its large share of nuclear power, France has a very good record in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of its electric sector. That doesn't mean France has a very good record for greenhouse gas emissions altogether. It's thanks to this advantage better than the average of comparable countries, but still we have emissions that are much too high, especially compared to ambitious objectives we have adopted. But the issue is not to consider that we could stick with the system. The issue is to prepare for the next system. As I said, I mean, most of the reactors have been built a long time ago. We need to prepare for a complete reordering of new generation capacity, and we therefore need to decide whether it's better from different perspectives, which includes carbon neutrality, of course, which includes electric security, include cost and competitiveness, creation of value in the French territory, and energy security, in the sense that we need to consider, as Simon said, in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. And I mean, what these scenarios, I mean, the one that négaWatt developed, and I didn't talk about it because I think those official ones are most important. I mean, what those scenarios show is that it is not only feasible to aim for 100% renewable system, but it clearly could bring, especially as they are not up yet to gaining in competitiveness. So this could bring benefits on all of these criteria. And therefore, the question is, how do we shift? And the issue is that because it's difficult to shift, the government tends to stick to the current policies and options, which is probably kind of accumulating even more difficulty to shift in the next decade.
A ještě bych měla jeden dotaz. Vlastně pan Miller, když nám prezentoval tu situaci v Německu, tak on říkal, že i veřejnost, řekněme, už není pro pokračování té jaderné energetiky. Jak je to ve Francii? Vlastně jsou Francouzi, francouzská populace připravena na to změnit ten francouzský energetický mix, nebo jaká je ta nálada veřejnosti? Nevím, jestli máte nějaké osobní zkušenosti, nebo jestli jsou nějaké průzkumy, co si o tom myslí veřejnost.
Well, it's quite difficult to say, especially because the current crisis is kind of reshuffling arguments and perspectives. I mean, what has always been clear is that the French population was very much in favor of existing reactors, for one part because they were perceived as a benefit, and also because they were perceived as something too heavy to shift away from, and much less positive on new reactors, and much more aligned on the public opinion in other countries. I'm not talking about Germany, but the average European countries when it comes to new reactors. What has deeply changed is that for decades, the French population stuck to that kind of national image, national representation of nuclear energy being the pillar, not one pillar, but the pillar of French energy policy. And I think French public opinion just went away from this image. The idea that nuclear is bound to decline and that we need to tackle that issue is clearly dominating. It's probably the nuclear lobby that has not understood or that has not accepted yet this perspective of a decline.